welcome. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I do want to remind everyone to put their phones on silent or vibrate. I would also like you to know that there is an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the program. You may have noticed that we are filming tonight's event. If you ask a question, it does not mean that you are on the camera, but I do ask that you speak into the microphone so we can have your question on the video. I would like to officially welcome you to our third Art History and Landscape lecture. This is a program that we are dedicated to looking at this intersection, but also really bringing exciting, prominent, and people who are really changing their fields when it comes to these topics. If you are interested in these kinds of programs, I invite you to join our newsletter, check out our website, like us on Facebook. The next one will be in the fall, and it coincides with all the different things that we're doing here. But tonight's program we're incredibly excited about, in part because of the speaker and also because of the topic. Alice Cooney Frelinghuysen is the Anthony C. and Lulu C. Wang Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She's published widely and curated exhibitions on American ceramics and glass, as well as the 19th century decorative arts with a focus on Tiffany. In 2009, she oversaw the curatorial team that reinstalled the American Wing's Charles Engelhardt Court. And as a graduate of Princeton University, she also earned her MA at the Winterthur program in early American culture. She's currently working on a book on the Robert A. Ellison Jr. collection of American art pottery, the installation of the Worsham Rockefeller dressing room, and a complimentary exhibition on George A. Chastais. So thank you for coming out and speaking with us tonight. Tonight's topic will focus on the work of Louis Comfort Tiffany and his studio. Residents of Greenwich are fortunate because we have quite a few examples of Tiffany's work here in town. Just up the street on the Post Road in Christchurch, there are examples of his stained glass windows. And then upon special request, there is a mosaic that's not as well known in the Second Congregational Church. It's in their music practice room, but it is there. And then Greenwich was also home to Louisine Havemeyer, a highly regarded art collector and a patron of Tiffany's work. So we actually have a Greenwich resident to thank for some of the wonderful pieces that we still have to enjoy today. Tiffany's aesthetic was based on the idea that nature should be the primary source of design inspiration. It permeates every aspect of his work, from design, layout, and color choice. And it also corresponds with all the different types of work that he did, including furniture, textiles, and glass blowing. But in order to create his many masterpieces, Tiffany carefully selected a group of artists and craftspeople, and many have gone without recognition for their contributions. So in tonight's lecture, Frelinghuysen will shed light on the light of these studio workers' work, as well as Agnes Northrop. She was the only truly independent female designer in the studio, and she my apologies. Frelinghuysen will explore the ways that she joined the studio as well as contributed to its work. Thank you.
Thank you both. It's a great pleasure and delight for me to be here in Greenwich on this gorgeous day and to look at your spectacular yellow iris as you walk in the door here. It seems particularly appropriate for what we're talking about this evening. And I think it's particularly appropriate that this lecture is in the name of David Wierdsma, because I think my topic tonight really is that intersection of art and history and landscape, and I will add gardens. And will shed light, I hope, I will highlight one particular aspect of the work of Louis Tiffany's work that particularly resonates with that topic. I've spent the better part of my career studying various aspects of the work of Louis Tiffany. Of course, Tiffany is a well-known name. He was son of the founder of the eponymous jewelry and silver store that remains on Fifth Avenue today. This artistic polymath whose career spanned over half a century, he worked in more diverse media than I would say any other artist of his time, and indeed perhaps of all time. A bold statement indeed, and I just show you just a few examples from the Met's collection right there. here in Greenwich alone, as Anna has said, his work spanned multiple media, and I'm going to sort of show some images to what Anna was just mentioning earlier. For example, Henry Osborne and Louisine Havemar built their summer house here in Greenwich, right on the Stamford border. They bought a big plot of land on Palmer Hill and built this fabulous Grosvenor Atterbury designed house in the late 1880s. And Tiffany, Louis Tiffany, who they were probably his most important patrons, was called in to do some of the decorations. But sadly, there are no interior photographs known of that house except for this one, which is of their daughter, Electra Havemar Webb, founder of the Shelburne Museum. And she's sitting in a rocking chair, and I don't know whether you can just see this sort of stenciled decoration here that was probably either done by Tiffanys Studios or inspired by him. But there was another house here in Greenwich, and this was the Towers. How many of you know what the Towers is? Oh, good. The Towers was located in the Byram Shore area of Greenwich, and this was built by Joseph Milbank. I think most people are more aware, well, Joseph Milbank, very important as a philanthropist, and his father, of course, was Jeremiah Milbank, who built the great big house on Putnam Avenue, which only the gates survive today. And of course, their fortune derived from their investment in Borden's condensed milk and then railroads, etc. And so the son, Joseph, went and built his own house, seen here, in the late 1890s. And he hired Tiffanys Studios to design the interiors as well. These would be completely unknown. The house is demolished, save for the survival of a photograph album that descended in the Milbank family. And I'll just show you a couple of them because they're quite extraordinary and quite avant-garde, I would say, and particularly perhaps for this area. Here is an image of the library. I don't know how well you can see this, but maybe you can see some of the sort of stencil decoration all around here. Very unusual furniture that I'm sure was designed to be en suite with the andirons, everything. This was sort of a moment when every element was designed to be integrated one to the other. I'll show you just a few others. This wonderful fireplace in the corner. These appear to be glass mosaics, and then this looks like some kind of metal, perhaps filigree, perhaps studded with glass jewels, and related to some of the interior work that Tiffany did for his own homes. And then this is probably the most extraordinary of all, which is the dining room. And you see here these wonderful stalactite blown Favril glass shades that are suspended from the ceiling in this unusual arrangement. Some Tiffany elements probably sitting there on the shelf there. And Tiffany designed all of the furnishings, the table, the chairs, even the carpet, and the upholstery that you see here. And again, linking to work that he did either before and after for his own homes. These two, of course, both long destroyed, but as Anna mentioned, I was particularly thrilled to have the opportunity to see this Favril glass mosaic lunette that's at the Second Congregational Church right across from those Milbank gates. And this was intended for for the Sunday school room in what was called the Memorial Chapel. It's now their choir room. And this was a memorial given by, and I just, hold on, the Edward Brush family. And you see this angel seated on a plinth. But what's really important and germane to our conversation this evening is she's set within this wonderful, luscious, really, landscape with tall cypress trees and almost exotic vegetation there. This was particularly exciting for me to see because we have in our collection a design drawing on the upper right-hand corner, which was completely unidentified. We didn't know for what it was made, for whom it was made, when it was made. And here we, to find the realization of that design is a very extraordinary and quite exciting discovery. And then in addition, there is one surviving ledger book from the Tiffany Studios Mosaic Workshop that's in the Morse Museum in Winter Park, Florida. And there, I was just down there recently, and there in this ledger book, it says that it talks about the Edward Brush Memorial, the mosaic that was commissioned, the sketch for it, which was in early March of 1907, and it was then dedicated very quickly thereafter in April of 1907. So we know a lot about this particular piece, which is exciting. That's more than you can say about a lot of Tiffany. And then, of course, across the street and just a little bit to the west, you have Christ Church, and they're quite wonderful windows. The Resurrection Angel here, who's standing in a garden, if you will, or sort of a field of wonderful flowers. And then this one, which is I think one of the most poignant of Tiffany's windows, and a very beautiful window in that church, a window that was a memorial to Amelia Higgins Barrett, and her son, and who died at age 5 of diphtheria, and then she died just the following year at just over 30. So this, and likely the faces are actually likenesses of the mother and child here, commissioned by her parents and the little boy's grandparents, but also to notice how these figures are really set within. The landscape is so much a part of this window. It's not just a figural window. She's seated in this huge mass of wonderful summer daisies. So that just to lay a little bit of the groundwork. And of course you know that glass was Tiffany's major medium, and he's renowned for the extraordinary innovations that he did in many areas, but also in developing a new kind of stained glass. But he was equally innovative in the introduction of novel subjects, notably landscapes and gardens. Such subjects were connected to various philosophical discourses in the second half of the 19th century. Swedenborgian thought that his artistic mentor George Inness had embraced, as well as ideals by Emerson and Thoreau on the spiritualism conveyed by nature. Fields and woodlands were widely admired as nature's gardens. Tiffany's earliest documented landscape window dates to 1895. This is the Isaac Harding Frothingham Memorial for the Church of the Savior in Brooklyn, with its Old Testament subject, the heart and the brook. At the time of its installation, a glowing write-up in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a description based no doubt on a press release written by Tiffany's very ambitious and perhaps aggressive marketing department. And I'll quote, "The lower part of the memorial window is a beautiful landscape representing a bounding brook, rushing brook in a forest glade, illuminated with the light of the setting sun, which warms and fills with a rich glow the most remote nook of the glade. So close to nature is the scene depicted that for a moment it seems as if it were nature itself seen through an open window." The landscape is actually only half of the window. The upper half of the window, above the balcony, was a figural design of angels designed by Frederick Wilson. But despite the dramatic innovation in subject matter represented here, and perhaps emblematic of the struggles of women receiving recognition for their work, the newspaper article only identified Wilson as the designer, failing to credit the designer of the landscape, Agnes Northrop. Northrop, who had worked for Tiffany longer than any other designer, the most important female designer, and one whose true specialty was landscapes and gardens. Tiffany did, however, credit Northrop for her design her design of the first landscape window that he published in a pamphlet dating to 1896, one of the vast amount of promotional literature that the studios produced. This little pamphlet featured 16 windows. All but one were figural designs, all designed by Tiffany's stable of male designers. only one woman was represented, Agnes Northrop, and only one landscape seen here. But who was this woman? Few archival records survive from the Tiffany studios, but recent research helps to shed new light on her, and indeed the important role played by women in Tiffany's studios. A great cache of letters from one of them, Clara Driscoll, a designer of floral lampshades and manager of what became known as the Tiffany Girls, was an important source. The Tiffany Girls, seen here posed for a photograph on the roof of the studio's building, were the women who were responsible for that critical phase in the production of windows and lampshades, which involved selecting the glass in the for the individual components and delicately cutting them into often intricate shapes. Driscoll is seen standing at the far left of the photograph. Northrop stands at the opposite end of the group of women. My interest in Northrop was sparked by two drawings in the Met's extensive holdings of design drawings from the Tiffany studios, and that bear Northrop's signature, and drawings are rarely signed. One, a floral border design for a Four Seasons allegorical window, and the other, an elaborate garden landscape. This began my quest. My search was aided by the discovery of a memoir that Northrop wrote very late in her life, helping to piece together her biography and providing documentation for a number of important commissions, prompting further research on Northrop, and indeed the opportunity to consider her work in a new light, and one which highlights her remarkable landscape and garden windows. The period that we're talking about, the late 19th and early 20th century, was also a period that coincided with the burgeoning garden movement that was taking the country by storm in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and which I posit had a similarly important influence on a particular kind of landscape that Tiffany Studios would produce, subjects that would become the domain of his designer, Agnes Northrop. So together they pioneered this new subject matter, and they worked on commissions for some of America's most prominent Gilded Age citizens. And I'll put together this tiny little rough biography of her. She was born in 1857 to Emily Fairchild and Allen P. Northrop in Flushing, a community in Queens. Her maternal grandfather, Ezra Fairchild, was a well-known educator and established the Fairchild Institute, also known as the Flushing Institute, in 1841. Her father taught at the school where he met Agnes's mother and married her. Tiffany acknowledged that his early schooling was in Flushing, and although the class rosters for the Institute for 1860 are no longer survive, when he would have matriculated there, it's likely that he attended the Institute as a young adolescent. Although the Institute was a noted private boarding school for boys, it gave Northrop her first formal education. She resided there for most of her life, even after the deaths of her parents, with a very brief stint, in fact, in my hometown, Darien, with her brother, and moving only in her final years to the Gramercy Park Hotel, where she died at the age of 96 in 1953. While the Fairchild Institute may account for Northrop's academic schooling, the source of her artistic training is unknown. She's said to have had an early aptitude for art and briefly designed book covers for a publishing house, like other women of the era. And I just show you here a book cover and a stained glass window design by Northrop's contemporary, Sarah Wyman Whitman. One cannot say definitively when Northrop began her career with Tiffany, but in her memoir, she recalled that in 1884, at the age of 27, she knew someone who had a friend who had worked in Mr. Tiffany's stained glass business, and she was introduced to him. Tiffany then referred her to his manager, who told her that she could try it. Northrop fit the requisite profile of the women that Tiffany employed. She was Protestant, middle class, and unmarried. During those early years, Northrop probably worked in varying capacities, aided by critiques from Tiffany and by her fellow designers. And by the early 1890s, she had forged an independent role for herself in the studios. The first published reference to Northrop's association with Tiffany dates to 1893, when she exhibited a cartoon for a window of an art museum at the Architectural League in New York, captioned as having been designed by L.C. Tiffany, drawn by A.F. Northrop. Although the cartoon's not known to survive, it may have been for a window in the Henry Field Memorial Gallery that Tiffany designed for the Art Institute of Chicago, also in 1893, and the only Tiffany Studios Art Museum commission that I'm aware of. So might it have been for the skylight, described as having, quote, slender bands in a lotus pattern in light and dark green on a field of soft, rich pink? 1893 was an important year for Tiffany and for Northrop. It was the year of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, intended to be the largest of the international exhibitions. It was also significant for its inclusion of the Women's Building, a kind of mini museum that would serve to illustrate the progress women had made over the past 400 years since the nation's founding. The building presented American applied arts by women: decorative painting, wood carving, pottery, jewelry, several categories of textiles, book design, and stained glass. Women artists who were working at the Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, as it was called at the time, might have had a bit of an edge, for Candace Wheeler, the mastermind of the building, had been a partner with Tiffany briefly in the early 1880s. Northrop contributed a sketch for an elaborate rose window. Tiffany himself put on an extensive display at the fair to great acclaim and said to have had 1.6 million people visit. Extraordinary. This landmark exhibition was pivotal in introducing Tiffany's art to the international public and to future clients as well. And it included an entire chapel complete with a mosaic, reredos, glass mosaic columns, a baptismal font, and leaded glass windows. Northrop was likely the designer of the Field of Lilies window that's seen beyond the mosaic columns, and even the suggestion in glass of those columns. Indeed, an important article in the Art Interchange the following year, it was said that Northrop had a natural talent for flowers and all conventional designs, and she wisely made these her specialties. And I show you here that same article illustrated the window on your right of conventionalized Annunciation lilies, and sort of I'm just making a little comparison there. It's sort of loosely derived from 13th century medallion windows, but its subject is truly these flowers. Northrop didn't work with the other women in Tiffany's employ, the glass cutting room where the women selected and arranged and cut the glass, although she depended very much on them for their sensitive realization of her designs. Nor did she work in the studio with the other male designers. At least by the early 1890s, she had a studio of her own, away from the girls, and it was described as you would reach it by walking through a labyrinthine hall to a small room with a few flower studies in color and great sheets of manila paper tacked to the walls. The process began with a small watercolor rendering, usually at a scale of 1 inch to a foot. And these are small, not bigger than about 12 inches. And watercolor, of course, was the perfect medium to evoke the qualities of colored glass and light coming through it with that wonderful translucency of the medium. The sketch was then cast in the designing room into a cartoon that would be the exact size of the final window. Northrop was likely involved in this process, at least from time to time. And from there, it was turned over to the girls, the selectors and cutters. Northrop was one of the few women to secure a patent for her designs, and her first dates to 1896. Seen here, this is the actual photograph that she submitted with her patent submission. But I think when you look at the realization of her design here, as it is today at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Brooklyn, The central panel features a jeweled cross surrounded by cherub faces, but the lower half of it and the side lancets display floral motifs, purple clematis, and stylized leaves and passion flower blossoms in an artistic style that she used over and over in some of her windows. The windows which Northrop was most associated, however, are those for her family's church in Flushing, the Reformed church where her grandfather, Reverend Ezra Fairchild, became pastor in 1865. Family members, including Agnes, were baptized, worshipped, and buried there. In 1892, they erected a new building to be adorned with modern windows, and they were particularly proud of their local girl as the designer. In 1899, she designed this window, the Robert Baker Memorial. The central panel features floral motifs. You see here Annunciation lilies at the top, and then fantastic peonies in the center with these marvelous poppies at the very bottom portion. Just to show you a detail of that slide. And these motifs would have had particular resonance for the deceased and his family, for Baker had been vice president of one of the largest nurseries in Flushing. Northrop received perhaps a more poignant commission in 1903 when she was asked to design a window to memorialize her own father, who had served as an elder in the church. Evoking medallion windows in its general overall composition, the top medallion encloses an ethereal opalescent glass heavenly city. But a stylized fruit tree dominates the window, set in a landscape of a stream meandering through purple mountains, a theme that connects with the emblematic of the voyage of life of the deceased. Conventionalized passion flowers frame the composition, as you can see in this wonderful detail that I couldn't resist. But floral motifs were also considered particularly appropriate for her father, because it was noted in the local paper when this was unveiled that, quote, one of Mr. Northrop's chief pleasures was working in his flower garden. And that must have provided certainly some important subject matter for Agnes's work. Although Northrop was a designer of windows, Clara Driscoll's letters reveal that from time to time, Tiffany directed Northrop to assist the Tiffany girls when they were short-staffed. He suggested, for example, that she help Driscoll on, I was just going back to that, on the design of his deep sea lamp here. She again helped Driscoll with some small bronze boxes based on Queen Anne's lace and other decorative objects. And she even designed silk lampshade panels like these with stylized flocks. Northrop knew the drill. She had preceded Driscoll as head of the Tiffany girls for about a year or so, with about 9 young women under her, but she never liked being in a managerial role, preferring her work designing windows. She later recalled that she was ever so pleased when she learned of Driscoll's arrival and gladly resigned in her favor. It's important to note that numerous artists designed Tiffany's windows. In the true sense of a studio, there was a constant flow of work from the designers to those who executed the leaded glass, all under Tiffany's supervision. But of the men and women involved in the studios during the 1880s and 1890s, Northrop outlasted them all and enjoyed her unprecedented career of over half a century. Most of the designers were men. In addition to Tiffany, Frederick Wilson, Joseph Lauber, Jacob Holzer, Edward Sperry, to name a few. Yet, like many of the women designers of Tiffany lamps and windows, Northrop was not generally credited for her role. The studios were active and busy, and Driscoll's letters suggest that it was an atmosphere of collaboration more than has perhaps previously been acknowledged. In true studio fashion, it was apparently not unusual for two designers to work on different aspects of a single window. A description published in 1894 acknowledged that Northrop was called upon to add details and flowers to many important windows, One was singled out, and that was the design for the Jay Gould Memorial in Roxbury, New York, where Northrop drew the foliage, the floral background, and British-trained Wilson, the principal designer of Tiffany's figural windows, designed the central figure. This design that I showed you earlier for an allegorical Four Seasons window documents an important collaboration between Tiffany and Northrop. This was made for Walter Jennings' Long Island mansion, Burwood, just across from Cold Spring Harbor from Tiffany's own country estate, Laurelton Hall. Jennings, a founder of Standard Oil, commissioned the window for the landing of the grand staircase above the entrance, which was a typical location for Tiffany domestic windows. Decorative floral panels framed this long rectangle with two figural panels that depict the seasons, which are remarkably close to the original, which does survive, as you can see here. Extremely close, not always the case. So you've got fall and winter down below and spring and summer at the top. The drawing, however, at the very bottom reveals, and I don't know how well you can see it, but it reveals Tiffany's signature on a drawing, which is incredibly unusual in all of these design drawings. Lulu C. Tiffany. The bottom of the floral border has A.F. Northrop. The border, however, does not survive, sadly, and it's composed of 12 individual floral panels, perhaps as much favored temporal allegories themselves, referencing in their number the months of the year. Each depicts a different flower. The two side panels, one with the hourglass and the other with a sickle, also allude to the passage of time. But they all offer a virtual vocabulary tablet of some of Northrop and Tiffany's favorite motifs that you see on windows and lamps throughout his career. The top register, with its climbing white clematis, purple wisteria, trumpet vine, and purple clematis, all flowering vines. The bottom was all water plants, the water lily, lotus, and Japanese iris. And then two panels on the sides depict vases of flowers, one of peonies and the other of poppies. Floral studies were introduced as subject matter in their own right for stained glass during the aesthetic era of the late 19th century. Some windows, such as this by Daniel Cottier, reference the British pre-Raphaelite style. John Lafarge's flower studies were equally distinctive in their homage to Japanese art, such as the Met's Peonies Blowing in the Wind. Both windows here date to about 1880. Northrop, however, forged her own individualistic style, at times more decorative, in a more decorative mode, but at others more naturalistic and perhaps even modernist. One of her most notable floral studies is her Magnolia Window, made for the Paris Exposition of 1900, and now in the collection of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. It's almost abstract in its rich assemblage of 5 luscious magnolia blossoms. Its creamy white petals are arrayed in such a fashion that they're almost indistinguishable from the dense green foliage, and it received high critical acclaim from the press and garnered a diploma of merit from the judges who singled Northrop out for the excellence of the windows designed by her for Tiffany Studios. Whether Tiffany would have credited the window to her and others to the other designers is not known, because the requirements for exhibition at that fair stipulated that all entrants supply their designers' names. So, and otherwise, it might have been impossible for us to know. The window, however, is evidence of Northrop's careful observation of nature. And indeed, magnolias were a subject of a particularly beautiful watercolor study that she did, as well as for a photograph of hers. You can see her signature in the bottom right. The relatively large number of her photographs that survive is testament not only to Northrop's interest in nature, but also to her early interest in photography. Northrop's use of a camera prompted Driscoll to write in one of her letters on June 15th, 1898, that, quote, Miss Northrop has a $60 camera and has taken some beautiful photographs of dogwoods, ferns, and other plants that are so fine. They are of great value to her. The only trouble is that the expense is only begun when the camera is bought. Each photograph costs something. Driscoll's concern over the cost, and Tiffany's for that matter, didn't seem to faze Northrop, however, as seen on a sketching trip to Europe that Northrop took at Tiffany's invitation, joining Driscoll and Parker McElhenney, also in Tiffany's employ. In the journal that Tiffany kept of that trip, and one of the very few Tiffany manuscript materials surviving, he wrote in July of 1907 that he insisted that, quote, Dr. McElhenney and Mrs. Driscoll saved the film and photographed only what I selected. But I could do nothing with Miss Northrop, who took a picture regardless of anything I said. She would have benefited from our digital age, for sure. Nonetheless, her photographs of plants provided important source material for many of her windows. Tiffany's journal of that trip provides further confirmation of her focus on floral subjects. They toured the French countryside, traveling apparently in a flashy automobile, photographing and sketching, apparently with greater or lesser success. Tiffany commented on one outing that Miss Northrop tore hers up. Mrs. Driscoll's in pencil, no good. And here you see Tiffany in the middle, Clara on his right, and Agnes on your left, all sketching on the sidewalk in Quimper. On another day, Tiffany bought for Agnes some very fine gladiolas, dark purple, very rich, a peculiar salmon pink and cooler pinks, asked her to stay at home and paint these. And a few days later, he purchased some fine dahlias, almost like chrysanthemums, sent them all home, and found Miss Northrop arranging them when I got back. Photography played a larger part in the design process than has been recognized. And I just show you the Hart and Brook landscape that I showed you earlier. And interestingly enough, it's not the sublime landscape that attracted many American landscape painters of earlier decades, but rather presents an intimate, familiar view. I speculate that Northrop's local surroundings served as inspiration, suggested by a luminous photograph that she took of her local Kissena Brook, part of Kissena Park in Flushing, which captures here a scene of a meandering rock-strewn brook surrounded by trees. It was a design she came back to often, here for a church in New Haven, dating a full decade later. She would eventually introduce this now almost generic view used in ecclesiastic settings to, as Northrop wrote, apartments where a window was wanted for color and to blot out a view not interesting. Here, for example, is a window she designed in 1910 for the New York dining room of Helen Gould, the daughter of Robert Baron Jay Gould. The subject of a rock-filled stream amidst autumn foliage bears a striking similarity to the Met's autumn landscape window, it too a domestic window. The original design drawing for this, tiny, and you know how big the window is, the original design drawing is dated 1923 and inscribed that it was made for Laurent Delbert Toll in Brookline, Massachusetts, where he was building a large neo-Gothic mansion. The window, however, if you think of these as memorial windows, I feel is somewhat prophetic. These were subjects like this often graced churches as memorials or mausoleums as well. Toll, however, went bankrupt and died before his house was even completed, and presumably his heirs, unable to pay his debts, including the Tiffany Studios bill, defaulted, and Tiffany convinced his close friend, Robert DeForest, to donate the window to the Metropolitan in 1925. It was about the same time that Northrop was working on the design for the Gould window that Tiffany Studios received a commission for some windows for a small church, Union Church, in Proctor, Vermont. The town, founded by the Proctor family, is best known for its marble quarries and stone cutting. The lengthy correspondence that survives between the Proctor family and Tiffany Studios sheds unusual light on the patron-client relationship. One of the founders of the town, Frederick Proctor, first contacted Tiffany Studios in 1909 requesting a window. The studios wrote in reply, "We'll be glad to prepare special designs for your consideration, or possibly you might have a particular subject in mind." With that, Proctor then suggested the view of the Vermont mountains visible from the church, and he sent the studios photographs of the view of Mount Killington and Mount Pico, which the family partially owned. These photographs were then turned over to Northrop. One of these photographs, this one, remarkably survived in a chest of Northrop's effects, and we're able to put this all together. Several sketches were drawn. They were sent back and forth. Full-size cartoons were made, visits back and forth to the studios, much bargaining. The original estimate was $4,000 to $5,000 per window, which was finally negotiated to about $2,000 per window. The resulting window, based on that photograph, was completed in 1911 and is a luminous depiction of that spectacular site-specific mountain view in summer. So successful was that window that when Frederick Proctor died the following year, his widow went to Tiffany Studios to commission a companion, Autumn. And although the photograph doesn't survive, it's clearly meant to represent, and perhaps specifically, Vermont's countryside in its fiery autumn foliage. It's likely that Northrop was also responsible for the design of Proctor's third window, dating to nearly 2 decades later, this time a memorial to Frederick's widow, and here depicting spring with its wonderful field of daffodils in the foreground. Northrop adapted her mountain landscape theme again in 1913 in perhaps a more structured landscape composition that's almost, I think, arts and crafts in its aesthetic, with its rigid vertical trees that serve as a framing device and the canopy of greenery at the top. But here she's added a profusion of pink laurel and rhododendrons in the foreground. The window figured prominently in Northrop's memoirs, no doubt for the importance of the commission from Andrew Carnegie for a window in memory of his parents and siblings for Dunfermline Abbey in Scotland. Carnegie visited the studios often. During the process, he contributed various suggestions, some not chosen, like replacing the rhododendrons in the foreground with thistles to connect to his Scottish heritage. The reception of the window, however, demonstrates that Tiffany's and Northrop's new subject matter was not universally embraced. As arresting as the design was, the window proved too radical for a more conservative British clientele, steeped in their tradition of narrative windows. The pure landscape offended their clergy. It was rejected for the Abbey totally because it was deemed what they called unecclesiastic and too modern. They wanted conventional designs drawn from geometry or history, and rejected the new opalescent glass as well, preferring as well, as they called it, windows made up of little pieces of glass. And so I'll conclude by looking at Tiffany and Northrop in light of their bridging the worlds of landscapes and gardens from a new perspective, and more particularly connecting the world of stained glass with the blossoming garden movement and the work of the American Impressionist painters. The flourishing of Tiffany's landscape and garden windows coincided with gardens themselves becoming a dominant subject in American paintings, a theme rarely encountered prior to the advent of Impressionism. And Susan Larkin, who's here, could tell you much more about this subject than I. But I just show you this wonderful watercolor depicting, by Childe Hassam, depicting Celia Thaxter's garden. These artists painted colorful, intimate, pleasing, domestic-sized scaled gardens, and these found great favor amongst the American public. With urbanization and denser and noisier city living, many people were fleeing and moving to newly formed suburbs where they made their own private domestic scaled gardens. At the same time, the newly rich, who were creating grand homes in cities like New York on Fifth Avenue, were building concomitant country estates, establishing seasonal resort homes in communities like the Berkshires, Newport, Rhode Island, Connecticut's coast, and Long Island's North Shore. And I show you here two early 20th century estate gardens, these are from the Smithsonian's digitization project of the Garden Club of America, digitizing lantern slides in that collection, both of Long Island gardens here, one on the left of the Doubleday garden, and on your right for Mrs. Harold Pratt, a Tiffany patron in Glen Cove. This interest in gardens of all kinds was fueled by the proliferation of gardening articles in the popular press as well. The new magazines and books devoted to the subject, House and Garden, which started publication in 1901, Country Life in America, just two, and countless publications, many authored by women, such as Alice Morse Earle's Old Time Gardens of 1901 and Hildegard Hawthorne's The Lure of the Garden of 1911, which provided both practical advice as well as well-illustrated discussions of garden design and philosophy. Garden clubs and societies were sprouting nationwide, culminating in the founding of the Garden Club of America in 1913. To quote Anna Lee Merritt from her 1908 book, An Artist's Garden, quote, "An artist's interest in gardening is to produce pictures without brushes." Indeed, I would argue that Tiffany and Northrop demonstrate another way to produce pictures without brushes. This sentiment was put forth perhaps more specifically by noted landscape architect Beatrix Farron the previous year when she wrote an essay for Scribner's magazine entitled The Garden as a Picture. And I quote, "The landscape gardener paints with actual line, color, and perspective to make a composition, as the maker of stained glass does." The period saw a proliferation of interest on the part of artists to construct their own gardens, which often served as subjects for their paintings, such as the gardens of the Artistic Circle of Cornish, New Hampshire, or of John Henry Twachtman, a local boy here in Greenwich, as well as the Hollyhock House garden painted by members of the Cobb Art Colony. And this is here in the collection of the Holly House, and is a wonderful, I think, pastel of about 1900 by the artist Walter Fitch of the garden here. And certainly gardens were an important theme for Impressionist painters here and abroad. Tiffany himself was something of a self-taught landscape architect, and he designed extensive gardens for his own 400-acre country estate, Laurelton Hall. He created both formal and natural gardens throughout his property, as these rare color images from country life in America suggest. Often demonstrating his preference for native varieties, they included sweeps of purple iris near a pond or pool of water with great clusters of water lilies on your right. He maintained extensive greenhouses to continually restock the gardens, terraces, and interior court. And when he commissioned the Spanish artist Joaquin Sorolla to do his portrait in 1911, he chose as his setting the flower-filled terraces of Laurelton Hall. This is just across Long Island Sound, of course, is what he's looking at. Although Northrop didn't have the space nor means to maintain a garden of her own, there was the one that she frequently visited at the Flushing Institute, as seen in her photograph of hydrangeas in bloom there. And perhaps more importantly, during the third quarter of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, her hometown of Flushing was dominated by the horticultural industry. The first commercial nursery in the nation was founded there in 1735, and the industry grew exponentially in the 19th century. As the garden movement flourished in the ensuing decades, by the turn of the century, Flushing was the nursery capital of certainly this New York and widespread surrounding areas. There were at least 5 large nurseries established there, and is witnessed by these trade catalogs, and these are just a few in the collection of the Botanical Garden in the Bronx, dating to the first decades of the 20th century. They were extensive indeed. There were at least 20 different varieties of magnolias listed, for example, in Parsons' nursery catalog alone. During this period, nurseries took on the role of botanical gardens and invited members of the public to view and enjoy their stock, and Northrop most certainly spent much time there. Pure garden windows were typically more the province of domestic commissions than ecclesiastic, with few exceptions. One of the earliest of her domestic garden landscapes dates to 1905, this glorious window now in the Corning Museum of Glass. It was commissioned by Melchior Beltzhofer, an oil and cotton millionaire from Natchez, Mississippi, for Rock Rhone, the 44-room castle he built in Irvington, New York. The mansion's architect, A.J. Manning, was not notable other than the fact that he was local, and Tiffany had worked with him on several other occasions. The house overlooked the Hudson River, and indeed the landscape in stained glass suggests the views of the Hudson as it might have been seen from the house. The foreground, however, is the garden, with the flowers serving as framing elements. As such, the grandeur of the Hudson is mediated by the more comfortable garden flowers, recognizable species, hollyhocks, trumpet vines, and clematis. The window created by Northrop, an artistic invention for a perpetual garden. Such gardens were redolent of the old-fashioned garden, part of the nostalgic atmosphere of the colonial revival. These gardens were comforting and expressed reassuring notions to an America anxious over the potent political and social changes taking place in the decades following the nation's centennial in 1876. Issues of immigration from both Europe and Asia, and the stirrings of unrest that would lead to World War I. Gardens were also considered for their therapeutic qualities. Thus, depictions of gardens in one's home, in paintings or windows, imparted qualities of well-being year-round. But unlike a painting, a stained glass window went one step further. It actually closed off the troubling world outside, presenting instead an idealized garden view. The noted landscape architect Fletcher Steele, in his article, Tying Together House and Garden, wrote in 1915, "If care is taken that every house window shall be a frame for a beautiful picture, and that there be as much variety as possible in the views, the landscape will become a living picture tied up with the house in the best way." As Impressionist paintings often showed domestic gardens viewed from a window or a doorway, a garden stained glass window would literally provide a constant, pleasing garden view, not from the window, but as the window, and as such, the garden always at its peak. One of the most elaborate of Northrop's domestic garden windows was this 3-panel panorama-like window made in 1913 for Sarah Cochran's country estate, Linden Hall, outside of Pittsburgh. The drawing, which I showed you earlier, I hope you recognize, composed of delicate washes of gouache and semi-transparent watercolors, confirmed the authorship. You see her signature at the bottom right. It was commissioned by a woman. Cochran's husband, Philip, had died young, but not before making a fortune developing a process to make coke, and thus providing her with the means to build Linden Hall. Cochran loved gardens, and established extensive ones on her grounds, hence the subject that she requested for the windows. Actually, they're on the opposite side of the house here. And so these perhaps might be less of a fictionalized garden and perhaps actually based on some of Cochran's own gardens. The garden had the garden itself, we know, had a long vista through tall pines, flanking a central sculptural fountain. And as you see in the side panels depicted on the left, you see the species much favored by Northrop and the American Impressionists. The foxglove and peonies here are on the panel on your right of hollyhocks. Indeed, the plants that Northrop depicted for her garden windows aligned very closely with the comforting nostalgia of those old-fashioned gardens and promoted by the many garden writers. Hollyhocks, peonies, iris, poppies, lilies, sweet william, and foxglove. And just take the hollyhock, most esteemed, and I show you here Twachman's view of painting of hollyhocks at his garden, I think appropriately. And again here, Frieseke's among the hollyhocks dating to 1911. Just two examples. Most writers talk specifically about the simpler single blossom variety that they preferred to the double ones. And these were conjuring up images of colonial ancestors. Candace Wheeler, Tiffany's partner in his early career, wrote in 1901 in her book, Content in a Garden, "The hollyhocks of our present gardens stretch back as an unbroken chain of linked seeds back to the gardens of our Puritan foremothers." It was much favored in gardens, painting, and stained glass. Foxglove and peonies also appealed to Northrop and her fellow Impressionist painters, again suggestive of this antiquarianism, grandmother's garden. Similarly, the iris, through its associations with the old-fashioned garden, and I think, of course, as we walked in, was promoted throughout the period. Articles proliferated on its suitability in the various periodicals and books of the time, and it provided subject for painters like Maria Oakey Dewing and her Iris at Dawn of 1899. The old-time garden association combined with Christian iconography, making iris and lilies ideal subjects for garden stained glass memorials, such as this mausoleum window of magnolias and iris in the Met's collection. And I can't help but compare the iris in the window where this detail of Tiffany's own garden of his massed purple irises. Northrop in her windows also exploited the varied textures, lush colors, and light effects that were made possible only with her employer's special opalescent glass and plating. American Impressionists often peopled their garden pictures with women, but Northrop generally did not. One exception is this window that dates about the same time as the Cochrane window. It was commissioned for Swannanoa, the commanding country estate of Richmond, Virginia millionaire James Dooley and his wife Sally May. This was Dooley's mountain retreat. They lived in a grand house in Richmond called Maymont, which is a historic house open today, which also has a massive Tiffany window. Swannanoa, privately owned today, is located on a high crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And here the figure is the personification of Sally May, just having gathered flowers or greenery from the garden. The idealized woman garbed in a flowing white classical gown rather than one of more contemporary fashion. The figure aside, its composition conforms to that of the Cochrane and Beltzhover windows. She's flanked by banks of foxglove on one side and hollyhocks on the right, with masses of marigolds and pink roses climbing the pergola. The rendering of foxglove and hollyhocks in the Cochrane and Dooley windows suggests that Northrop may have provided a series of designs for Cyrus McCormick when he commissioned Tiffany Studios to design windows in 1922 in memory of his wife for St. Mary's by the Sea in Carmel, California, which gives you a sense of the wide range of Tiffany's work. This drawing here was labeled Scheme Number 7, indicating that there must have been at least 7 different designs that were presented to Mr. McCormick before he made his final selection, seen here. And similar subjects appear in 2 garden windows that Tiffany installed at Laurelton Hall during the mid-teens when he was embellishing his country estate with a collection of windows from his studios that he considered among the very best. Further testament of Tiffany's high regard for Northrop's work, these sadly destroyed when Laurelton Hall burned to the ground in 1957. Agnes Northrop, therefore, in her extraordinary 5-decade-long career as an artist at Tiffany Studios, broke new barriers in a field dominated by men in establishing herself as one of the leading designers of stained glass windows. In connecting the worlds of landscapes and gardens with painting and stained glass, Northrop created illusionistic garden pictures, visions of light and color, works that are at once intimate and complex, that are perennial manifestations of the artistic and environmental movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time for a few questions, if anyone would like to.
First of all, Nani, thank you for a fascinating presentation. That was just great. I just wondered whether Tiffany Studios ever used the design drawings to do more than one version of the window.
Oh, absolutely. And wait for my next project. In fact, we have about 350 design drawings in our collection, and that really is my next project. There's a long process of conservation that goes along with this that we're in the midst of. But one of the things that we have discovered by looking carefully at these and going through this conservation project is that the use of photography in these. And so what might happen is, for example, the first window I showed you from Christchurch in Greenwich. Tiffany, that started with a small design drawing. He might have actually then taken a photograph of the design drawing, pasted that on another piece of paper. The next church maybe only had a single lancet. Maybe it was a different, maybe it was going to be put in an architectural setting, and painted over that, added to the sides of it. They were used over and over again, and cartoons were reused as well. Mind you, this is practice, however, that dates all the way back to medieval times, because where cartoons were duplicated.
I had heard that there was a Tiffany studio in Riverside here, and that sometimes in the pond they found pieces of Tiffany glass. Do you know anything about that?
I know nothing about that. I'm most curious to find out. To my knowledge, he didn't have studios outside of New York City and Corona, Queens, where most of his workshops were.
So the ladies who were sitting cutting glass, that was regular colored glass, correct?
It's regular colored glass, but it's not just, but regular colored glass is sort of misleading, because as you can see, for example, in this window, it's really unusual. The glass is streaked, it's
all modeled. Yeah.
It has different textures and different color effects, modeled glass. So they're not only choosing the color, they're choosing a piece that's going to have those striations exactly right,
Mm-hmm.
and then cutting it out, scoring it, cutting it out, and then putting it all together as if it's a great big
Thanks.
picture.
And then when they wanted to put a face on a figure, how did they mark the glass with the drawing, with the actual face? Or
Very, very good question. A window like this has no paint on it whatsoever, but all of the figural windows, he only did one, which apparently, unfortunately, the window doesn't survive, but he only did one that had no paint on it. So all of the faces and the arms and what was visible of the legs were all done by glass painting, and so that's actually enameled and glass painting, which is on the front surface of the piece, and then fired in a small kiln, so that it would preserve it. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Where was the glass manufactured?
His glass was manufactured in Corona in Queens, where he had quite extensive. He had quite an extensive factory building where all of the hot work of the studios were done. So that's where all the glass was actually made. And he would make sheets. They would make sheets of about this size, of many myriad colors and textures and the like, and they would roll it, they would fold it to give you the three-dimensionality to it. It's also where they would do the blown glass work, they would do the enamel work. They would do the pottery, anything that required this kind of heat. All of the assembling of everything took place in their workshops in New York City.
And does any of that exist anymore? Any of those buildings?
Sadly, no. And in fact, the Corona building, it was taken over by Roman Bronze Works, which is a noted bronze foundry. Did many noted American sculptors' work, and only recently was taken down altogether.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to piece together the whole process that goes from a designer's sketch to actually the lining and the leaded work.
It's quite an extraordinary project.
Like, would the designers be involved up
so
till what point?
That's a good question as well. And unfortunately, you know, we know a little bit, we don't know a lot specifically about what was going on there. So it started with a commission, and then the small drawing, the little watercolor drawing. And then from there, that drawing was blown up to a full-size drawing. And that drawing was often colored, but not always. Often it was just black and white. But on that drawing, there were heavy outlines drawn in. And the heavy outlines were to indicate where the leading would go, where the individual glass pieces would go. So then that, and there are usually two of these cartoons. Then one of them would be cut with a double-bladed scissors or knife. You would score it so that, and then you would take a piece of glass, clear, you know, color, transparent glass, and all of that would be affixed onto this piece of glass with beeswax. And it would be in front of a light of a window. If you look, there's some of the interior photographs still survive, and you see lots of these in front of windows. And so the design, they would have the small design to work with, and then they would, obviously the cartoon, the small design would give them the coloration. And then these women, largely women, would be then selecting from an inventory, which was like stacks of different colored glass. They would select the glass. They would take down the little piece of template from the cartoon, put it down, score it, cut it, and then replace the little template with beeswax onto the window itself. And then they would build the whole window, you know, hundreds of pieces of glass, just like a great big jigsaw puzzle, essentially. When that was done, and this was very precarious, they took this, and then it would go to the men. So they took this flat piece of glass where all this is all carefully, you know, put on with beeswax or something, and then it would go to the men. And at that point, well, at some point, I think women probably did this part. They cut small pieces of copper foil, which they affixed with beeswax to the edges of the glass. Each piece had to have this copper foil around it. And then the men would take melted lead solder, because solder doesn't stick to glass, so it would adhere to it would react to the copper, and that would hold it on one side. And then you have to you have to go through the entire window that way. Then you flip the whole window over and do the same thing to the back side. And I'm not even telling you is that sometimes you might have layers of glass. You might have as many as 5 layers of glass in one particular place. So this was a continual process. And I think at the time that the women were selecting, I think it varied on the window whether the designer was involved. In some of the most elaborate windows, I'm sure the designer was quite involved. We know Tiffany, we do have to have some of these letters talk about his Four Seasons window, which he designed, and he was very much involved in the process of the selection as well, or overseeing it, yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to go to him and then you.
Thank you for your lecture tonight. And speaking of the Four Season windows, I was up in Proctor, Vermont years ago and got to see the windows, and someone told me an amusing story, and I'd like to know if it's true. So Mr. Proctor wanted the church steeple represented in one of the windows, and the windows were shipped to Vermont without the steeple and promptly sent back to Manhattan, where Louis comforted Tiffany with his cane. He had a little silver-tipped cane.
Yeah.
Was so angry, just scratched the steeple into the window and sent it back.
You know, I've never heard that story. I don't know, but it's very interesting. Thank you. And I don't remember seeing a steeple in there, but I'm going to take another look. All right.
If this were perhaps several layers, what would a window that size approximately weigh?
Oh, golly. That's plenty. I mean, it was in different, you know, this one might have been in two pieces. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. This is really an amazing window that's owned privately, but I've got really good photographs. I've actually never seen this window in the flesh. They're heavy, but they're manageable because, you know, you've got one lancet, and as I say, that lancet could be in two different pieces that are then joined together when it's installed into the house itself.
So got time for one more.
In answer to how much it weighs, you've got to realize that lead is very heavy. The glass is very heavy. I know, because I make line-for-line copies of Tiffany stained glass.
Oh.
And I've never made anything that big, but when I make them 4 to 5 feet tall, my husband has to carry them.
Yeah, no, they are heavy. They are definitely heavy. I mean, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wonderful work.